You've probably heard the rumors, the headlines, the conversations over the years about this famous $200 raise for Social Security beneficiaries. It's one of those things that seems to pop up every few months, sparks excitement, gets people talking, and then somehow fades back into the background, leaving all of us wondering, was it ever real? Could it really happen? And most importantly, what would it actually mean if it did? That's exactly what we're going to dive into today, because on the surface a flat $200 raise for everyone sounds simple and fair. But as always, when we start pulling apart the layers, the story gets more complicated, and I want to walk you through it step by step, not just with numbers, but with real perspective on who actually benefits, who doesn't, and whether a plan like this stands any chance of becoming reality. So let's rewind the clock for just a moment. Back in March of 2020, right when the world was spinning in ways none of us could have predicted, a small group of senators introduced the idea of a temporary $200 per month raise for Social Security beneficiaries. It was presented as relief, something to help offset the challenges people were facing in those uncertain months. And honestly, at the time, it sounded like exactly what so many people needed. But here's the part that often gets forgotten: that raise was only ever designed to last until the end of the year. Just a few months, and then it would vanish. Imagine the disappointment if it had passed. You got used to that extra $200 showing up in your account each month, only to have it ripped away when the calendar turned to 2021. That might have felt like more of a cruel tease than real help. As it turned out, nothing came of it, so the question never became reality, but the seed of the idea was planted. Fast forward about a year and a half later, Senator Bernie Sanders brought the idea back to life. He wrapped it into something called the Social Security Expansion Act, which was much broader in scope, but yes, tucked inside that proposal was the now infamous $200 raise. And let's be honest, who wouldn't like to see a couple extra $100 show up every month? That's $2,400 a year, which for some people is the difference between covering the basics with a little less stress and constantly having to choose between food, medication, or utilities. That's not just a number, that's a lifeline. But here's where reality hits. Let's look at the big picture. Right now, more than 72.5 million people are receiving Social Security benefits every single month. That's retirees, people with disabilities, surviving spouses, children who've lost a parent, supplemental security income recipients, the list goes on. Now let's just imagine for a moment that every single one of those 72.5 million people suddenly got an extra $200 each month. What would that cost? Quick math tells us that would be about $14.5 billion more every single month. Multiply that by 12 months, and you're staring at $174 billion a year. Let that number sink in for a second. $174 billion, with a B. That's new spending on top of what Social Security already pays. Now, you might say, well, isn't that the whole point? Social Security is supposed to support people, and if people need more, then they need more. And I agree with you up to a point. The problem is that Social Security is already running a deficit. The money coming in from payroll taxes each month doesn't fully cover the benefits going out. To make up the difference, the Social Security Administration taps into the trust fund, that savings account built up from years of contributions. But that trust fund is shrinking every year. Think of it like your own savings account. If every month your expenses are more than your income, you dip into savings to cover the gap. And eventually, unless something changes, the savings run dry. That's the position Social Security is in. So when you hear lawmakers balk at adding another $174 billion a year to the bill, you start to understand why they hesitate. But here's the twist. Does everyone really need that $200? Let's be brutally honest for a moment. Someone already receiving $3,500 a month, or even the maximum benefit of a little over $5,000, probably doesn't need that extra money in the same way that someone scraping by on $1,000 or $1,500 does. Of course, nobody would say no to more cash, but does it make sense to spread it equally across the board? That's where the plan starts to show its cracks. Let's look at the average. Right now, the typical retirement benefit is just under $2,000 a month. That's the average, which means plenty of people are receiving less than that, and a smaller group are receiving much more. But averages can be misleading. It only takes a relatively small number of people with higher benefits to pull the average up. The reality is that the majority of beneficiaries are living on less than $2,000 a month. And for those people, $200 extra would make a world of difference. That's where the conversation starts to shift. So let's do some math again, but this time let's focus only on half of all beneficiaries, the ones receiving at or below the average. That's about 36 million people. If each of those people got $200 more each month, that would cost about $7.2 billion a month, or roughly $85 billion a year. Still a lot of money, but suddenly we've cut the price tag in half. Compared to $174 billion, 85 looks a lot more manageable, and perhaps even politically possible. Now, let's cut it down again. What if instead of half, we focus on just the group living at or below the poverty line? That's roughly 11 to 12 million people. Let's call it 12 million for simple math. Giving them an extra $200 a month would cost about $3.6 billion a month, or $36 billion a year. Still significant, but when you compare $36 billion to $174 billion, it suddenly looks like a bargain. And morally, how do lawmakers justify saying no to that? These are people already struggling the most, the ones who can least absorb rising prices, medical costs, and the daily expenses of simply staying alive. Here's what makes this whole debate fascinating. On paper, a universal $200 raise for all Social Security beneficiaries sounds generous, sounds fair, sounds easy. But in practice, it's a blunt tool. It doesn't distinguish between the people who desperately need help and those who would barely notice the difference. It's like giving everyone in a classroom the same size coat, no matter their size. Some kids will be swimming in fabric, and others will still be shivering. That's why the idea, as it stands, is flawed. But does that mean we throw it away completely? I don't think so. Imagine instead a targeted approach, one that says, yes, we'll raise benefits, but let's do it where it matters most. For the retiree living alone on $1,300 a month, suddenly bumping that to $1,500 gives breathing room. For the widow surviving on barely enough to cover rent, that extra $200 might be the difference between keeping her apartment or being forced to move. For a disabled worker relying solely on Social Security disability payments, $200 more could mean not having to choose between paying for groceries or paying for electricity. Those are real trade-offs happening every day in people's lives. The challenge is convincing lawmakers to think this way. Big, sweeping numbers scare them. $174 billion feels overwhelming, impossible, dead on arrival. But $36 billion? That at least feels like a conversation worth having. And even $85 billion, though heavy, might be feasible if presented as a middle ground. It's all about how the plan is framed, and whether it connects to the reality of people's needs instead of being written off as political fantasy. Now, you might be thinking, haven't lawmakers already ignored people living below the poverty line for years? Sadly, yes. Many of them have. But here's where strategy matters. When advocates and constituents go to Congress with a simple demand $200 for everyone, it's too easy for lawmakers to say no. The numbers are too high. The costs too intimidating. But if the ask is narrower, more targeted, and easier to defend in front of the public, suddenly the refusal looks cruel. Imagine the headline, Congress rejects $200 raise for seniors living below the poverty line. That's a harder one to sell to voters. That's why I believe the conversation needs to shift away from all or nothing and towards something practical and humane. Think about your own life for a second. Would you be okay if the wealthiest beneficiaries didn't see the extra $200 as long as the lowest income ones did? I think most of us would say yes. Because fairness isn't always about treating everyone exactly the same, it's about meeting needs. Some people don't need that money, and deep down, I suspect they'd admit it too. And yet, this debate is not just about numbers or policies. It's about dignity. It's about recognizing that after a lifetime of work, contribution, or simply surviving hardships beyond their control, people deserve security. Social Security is more than a monthly payment. It's a promise, a contract between generations. That's why the idea of increasing it stirs such strong feelings. It's not just math on a spreadsheet, it's food in the fridge, it's heat in the winter, it's medicine on the counter. So let's circle back to the beginning. Is the $200 raise a good idea? Yes, in spirit. But in execution, it's deeply flawed if applied across the board. Too costly, too blunt, too disconnected from the actual distribution of need. But reimagined, reshaped, focused on the people who need it most, it suddenly becomes not only good but necessary. And maybe, just maybe, achievable. Now, will lawmakers do it? That's the million-dollar, or rather, the billion-dollar question. They've ignored opportunities before. They've let the trust fund inch closer to depletion year after year. They've allowed inflation to chip away at the real value of benefits, even as costs climb. But pressure builds, and voices matter. And the more targeted and reasonable the demand, the harder it becomes to dismiss. I want you to think about this as a story still unfolding. The plan as originally written may never pass. But the conversation it started has already opened doors. Each time the idea returns, it gains a little more attention, a little more refinement. And sometimes, that's how change happens, not in one giant leap, but in steady steps. So what can you do with all of this? First, stay informed. Don't just take the headline at face value when you see $200 raise for all splashed across the news. Ask, who's proposing it? What does it really mean? What's the cost? Who benefits most? Second, use your voice. Lawmakers respond when constituents make noise, especially when the message is focused and reasonable. Saying give everyone $200 more is easy to dismiss. Saying help seniors living below the poverty line is a rallying cry much harder to ignore. At the end of the day, this isn't just about politics. It's about real lives, real struggles, and real choices people make every single day. Maybe you're living on Social Security right now and know exactly what $200 would mean for you. Or maybe you're still working but thinking about your parents, your grandparents, your own retirement down the line. Either way, this conversation touches everyone, because Social Security is woven into the fabric of American life. So let's keep the conversation alive, but let's also make it smarter. A $200 raise, yes, but not for everyone. For the people who need it. For the ones falling through the cracks. For the millions who did everything they were supposed to and still find themselves counting every penny each month. That's where the fight should be. That's where hope should be directed. And with that, I'll leave you with this thought. Big plans may sound exciting, but it's the practical, focused ones that often change lives. And if enough of us demand that lawmakers stop ignoring the most vulnerable, maybe someday soon, that extra $200 won't just be an idea floating in speeches and proposals. It'll be a reality in the bank accounts of the people who need it most.